1972 Hollywood Hills, a house party. The 11:30 p.m., the living room was packed. Steve McQueen leaning against a wall. Elvis Presley on a couch, drink in hand. James Coburn talking with Peter Sellers. Sharon Tate moving through as hostess. Roman Polanski's house. One of those Hollywood parties where everyone who mattered was present. Or at least, everyone who thought they mattered. The alcohol had been flowing for hours. The marijuana smoke hung in the air. The conversations were loud. The latter performative. Everyone playing the version of themselves they'd spent years constructing. The tough guys acting tough. The intellectuals acting intellectual. The legends acting legendary. Bruce Lee sat in a chair near the window. Not drinking. Never drinking. Watching. He'd been watching all night with growing irritation. Watching actors who played fighters talk about fighting. Watching men who'd never thrown a real punch in their lives discuss violence like they understood it. Watching Hollywood perform toughness the way it performed everything else, with complete confidence and zero authenticity. Bruce had come with James Coburn. Had thought it might be interesting. A chance to meet people, to network, to be part of the scene he was trying to break into. But 3 hours in, all he felt was frustrated. These people weren't real. None of them. They were characters playing characters. Even when they thought they were being themselves. Dan Martin stood in the corner of the room, away from the main crowd. Glass of what looked like whiskey in his hand. Apple juice. Always apple juice. He'd been watching too. Not with Bruce's visible frustration. With his usual calm observation. Dean had been to 1,000 parties like this. Had watched this same performance play out in 1,000 variations. He knew what it was. Understood exactly what everyone in the room was doing. Including himself. Bruce stood up suddenly. The movement sharp enough that nearby conversations stopped. He looked around the room. At the actors. The directors. The famous faces. And he said something that made the entire party go silent. Everyone here is a faki. His voice cut through the music, through the conversations, through the carefully maintained atmosphere of sophisticated Hollywood cool. You all talk, you all perform, you play tough guys in movies. Who here can actually do something? Anyone? The silence was complete, uncomfortable. Someone laughed nervously. Steve McQueen shifted against the wall. Elvis looked down at his dransard. Nobody moved. Bruce walked to the center of the room. I'm serious, he said. Everyone in this room makes their living pretending to be something they're not. Playing fighters. Playing warriors. Playing dangerous men. But none of you are any of those things. Steve McQueen finally spoke. What's your problem tonight, Lee? His voice had an edge. Defensive. My problem. Bruce turned to face him. My problem is you all believe your own performances. You think 'cause you play tough on screen that you are toughed. You're actors. Soft. Fake. The room tensed. This had gone past uncomfortable into something else. Something that might turn into an actual incident. Elvis tried to diffuse it. Come on, Bruce. We're all friends here. We're just having a good time. Bruce looked at him. Friends? You don't even know yourselves. How can you know each other? Then a voice from the corner. Calm. Almost quiet, but clear enough that everyone heard it. You're right. The room turned. Dean Martin stood there, still holding his glass, still perfectly calm. Bruce stared at him. What? Dean took a sip of his apple juice. You're right, we're performers. That's the job. We pretend it's what we're paid to do. Nobody spoke. This was not the response anyone expected. Not Bruce, not the room. Bruce walked toward Dean. Stopped a few feet away. So you admit you're fake? Dean met his eyes. Didn't flinch. I admit I'm honest about what I am. And what are you? A singer who acts, Dean said. Not a fighter who pretends to sing. Bruce studied him. The room held its breath. You're soft, Bruce said. All of you. Soft and fake and pretending to be hard. Dean nodded slightly. Probably. But I'm not pretending otherwise. Something shifted in Bruce's expression. The anger's still there, but something else underneath it. Recognition, maybe. or surprise. "You don't bullshit," Bruce said. "Not a quest statement." "No point," Dean said. "You'd see through it anyway." Bruce laughed, sudden, genuine. The first real laugh anyone had heard from him all night. He walked over to the chair next to where Dean was standing. Sat down, looked up at Dean. "Sit." Dean sat. The party slowly resumed around them. Conversations restarting. Music turning back up. Everyone pretending they hadn't just witnessed Bruce Lee call out an entire room and Dean Martin be the only one honest enough to agree with him. For the next hour, Bruce and Dean talked. While everyone else partied, while the room moved around them, they sat in that corner and had a conversation that nobody else was part of. Nobody knew what they talked about in detail. Nobody knew what Bruce said to make Dean laugh. Nobody knew what Dean said that made Bruce nod with what looked like respect. But everyone who was there that night remembered. Remembered Bruce challenging the room, remembered everyone backing down, remembered Dean being the only one who didn't. Not because he fought, because he was honest. The story stayed mostly private for decades. Too strange to tell. Too specific. Too revealing about what Hollywood actually was underneath the performance. Until the people who'd been there decided the truth was worth more than the legend. Hollywood in 1972 was a specific kind of world. Not the studio system world that had preceded it, not the controlled environment where moguls owned stars and every public appearance was scripted in advance, but something newer and stranger and in some ways more dangerous. The new Hollywood had arrived, bringing with it a generation of filmmakers and actors who believed that authenticity was the highest artistic value, that the old performances of the old Hollywood were exactly that, performances, and that real art required something rawer and more honest. The irony was that this commitment to authenticity had itself become a performance. The actors who wore their rebellion most visibly, who made the loudest claims about being real and genuine and uncompromised, were performing their authenticity as carefully as any studio-era star had performed their wholesome image. Roman Polanski's house parties were a particular distillation of this paradox. The guest lists combined old Hollywood and new, the famous and the avant-garde. The deeply establishment figures who'd been at this for decades, and the younger generation who'd arrived with the conviction that they were doing something entirely different. The conversations were sophisticated. The substance use was casual. The tone was one of people who prided themselves on seeing through pretension, which required, of course, a great deal of sophisticated pretension to maintain. Steve McQueen was there because McQueen was always at these things, because his particular brand of cool required presence at the places where cool was being defined. Elvis had come in from a Las Vegas engagement, staying in a rented house in the hills, attending parties with the slightly disconnected quality of a man who lived in a different world from everyone else but kept trying the ordinary social rituals to see if they'd fit. James Coburn was there with Bruce. They'd been training together for years, Coburn being one of the few Hollywood figures who approached martial arts with genuine seriousness rather than as a career accessory. Peter Sellers, Sharon Tate moving through the rooms with the grace of a natural hostess, keeping conversations flowing, keeping people comfortable, managing the social temperature with instinctive skill. And in the corner, separate from the main current of the party, Dean Martin with his apple juice, watching the performance and recognizing it for what it was. Bruce Lee had been in Hollywood long enough by 1972 to have developed specific and detailed frustrations about it. He'd done the television work, the Green Hornet, the guest appearances, and had watched Hollywood take the craft he'd devoted his life to and reduce it to choreography, to stunt work, to the visual suggestion of skill without any of the actual skill behind it. He'd seen actors who couldn't perform a basic defensive posture be portrayed as martial arts masters. He'd watched fight scenes be constructed from editing and camera angles that made anything look like anything, that made men who'd never trained a day in their lives appear formidable. The bastardization was thorough, and it was everywhere, and nobody seemed particularly bothered by it except Bruce, who was bothered by it constantly. The frustration went deeper than professional irritation. Bruce had built his entire philosophy, not just his martial arts philosophy, but his philosophy of living, on the principle of honest self-knowledge, on understanding exactly what you were and what you weren't, on refusing to perform competence you didn't actually possess. Jeet Kune Do, the system he'd developed, was built on the idea of eliminating everything false, everything stylistic, everything performed, and getting to what was actually effective, what actually worked when reality applied pressure to the theory. He brought this same standard to everything, which meant that Hollywood, which ran entirely on performed competence, on the elaborate construction of appearances that had nothing to do with underlying reality, was genuinely difficult for him to tolerate. Coming to that party with James Coburn had been, on some level, an attempt to engage with the Hollywood world that he needed to break into in order to reach the audiences he wanted to reach. What he found instead was a room full of exactly what he'd been hoping not to find, of famous men performing their famous man personas with the ease of long practice. And Bruce, sitting sober by the window, had watched it for 3 hours and reached the end of his patience. Dean Martin's position in the corner of that room was not accidental. Dean at parties had been occupying corners and edges for years, not because he was antisocial, not because he was shy, but because the corner gave him the angle of observation he preferred. He could see the whole room from the corner, could watch all the performances simultaneously, could track what was happening without being in the center of it. He was 54 years old in 1972 and had been attending Hollywood parties since before most of the people in that room were working professionally. He'd watched the style change, the clothes, the substances, the topics of conversation, the particular performance, each era constructed to distinguish itself from what had come before. And he'd noticed that the underlying dynamic never changed. People performed. Rooms full of famous people were rooms where every person was managing their image simultaneously, where nothing was entirely natural, where even genuine emotion was immediately processed through the filter of how it would appear. Dean understood this not with bitterness, but with a clarity that had taken years to develop. The apple juice was the purest expression of it. The glass that looked like whiskey, the performance of Dean Martin the drinker, maintained so consistently and completely that nobody who looked at the glass thought to question what was in it. He'd been doing it for 30 years. He knew exactly what he was doing, and because he knew exactly what he was doing, he could watch Bruce Lee across the room with recognition rather than defensiveness. Here was someone who was also seeing exactly what was happening in that room, who was less at peace with it than Dean was, who had decided, somewhere between arriving and 11:30, that he was going to say something about it. People who were there that night, and people who heard about what happened in the days and weeks and years that followed, developed theories about what the confrontation between Bruce and Dean had actually been about and what it had actually meant. 8 of those theories circulated persistently, and all 8 were wrong in ways that were instructive. The first theory was that Bruce had been drunk or high, that the outburst was substance-fueled, that Bruce without chemical inhibition would never have said what he said in that room. This theory was wrong in the most basic factual sense. Bruce Lee did not drink, did not use. His discipline on this point was as absolute, and everyone who knew him confirmed it. The theory required inventing a version of Bruce that didn't exist. The second theory was that a physical confrontation had nearly happened, that Steve McQueen or someone else had come close, to responding physically to Bruce's challenge. That the room had been one wrong word away from actual violence, and that Dean's intervention had been a de-escalation of an imminent fight. This theory was wrong. The tension in the room was social, not physical. Nobody in that room was going to throw a punch at Bruce Lee. The third theory was that Dean had challenged Bruce back, had responded to the accusation of fakeness not with agreement, but with some form of competitive assertion, some declaration of his own toughness or authenticity that had impressed Bruce and started the conversation. This theory fundamentally misunderstood what had actually happened. Den hadn't challenged anything. He'd agreed with everything. That was the point. The fourth theory blamed Steve McQueen, suggested that McQueen's defensive response to Bruce had escalated the situation and that Dean's intervention had been specifically directed at preventing McQueen from making it worse. McQueen's defensiveness was real, but it was a minor element of what happened rather than the cause of anything. The theory was wrong. The fifth theory held that the whole thing had been exaggerated in the retelling, that Bruce's outburst had been milder than the account suggested, that Dean's response had been less significant, that the story had grown in the years since because it was a good story and good stories grow. People who'd actually been there disagreed with this theory consistently. What happened was exactly as strange as the account said it was. The theory was wrong. The sixth theory suggested that Dean had made a joke, had deployed the Dean-Martin charm in the direction of Bruce's frustration and diffused the whole situation with some well-timed humor that Bruce had laughed at and responded to. This theory was close enough to something real that it kept circulating, but it got the mechanism wrong. Dean hadn't made a joke. He'd told the truth. That was different. The seventh theory proposed that Bruce had been testing the room for something, looking for actors with a certain quality that he needed for a project, auditioning the room for some kind of authenticity that would translate on screen. This theory was wrong and attributed a calculation to Bruce that the evening's atmosphere didn't support. The eighth theory put Sharon Tate at the center of the resolution, suggested she'd stepped between Bruce and the room, had managed the situation with the skill of an experienced hostess, had smoothed the confrontation over before it could develop into anything. Sharon had indeed been watching the situation carefully, but the resolution had come from Dean's corner before she'd needed to intervene. The theory was wrong, all wrong. The truth was stranger and simpler than any of them. This wasn't just Bruce Lee being angry at a party. This wasn't just a tense Hollywood night that got weird and then settled back into normal. This was about what happens when someone who has never learned to perform walks into a room where everyone is performing and refuses to pretend he doesn't see it. Bruce Lee didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't perform. He was exactly who he was at all times, disciplined, focused, honest to the point that the people around him sometimes experienced it as aggression because they'd never encountered that degree of unmediated reality in a social setting. And Hollywood in 1972 was the precise opposite of everything Bruce valued. Everyone performing, everyone maintaining the character they'd built over years of public life. Everyone confusing the performance with the person to such a degree that they'd forgotten there was a distinction. Dean Martin had been navigating this world for 40 years, had built his career on a performance so complete and so consistent that the world had accepted it as reality. But Dean had never lost track of the distinction. That was the thing that made what happened next possible. When Bruce challenged the room, Dean was the only person in it who could answer honestly because he was the only one who'd stayed honest with himself. But nobody knew what they talked about for that hour, not for decades. If stories like this matter to you, the moments when honesty costs something but someone does it anyway. Subscribe now. There's an entire Dean Martin playlist of these moments. The witnesses to what happened that night gave their accounts over years and decades, and the accounts built a picture of the event without completing it. James Coburn, who had brought Bruce to the party and had watched the confrontation from across the room, spoke about it in interviews through the 1980s with a mixture of embarrassment about Bruce's outburst and admiration for what followed. He said Bruce talked about Dean Martin for years after that night. Not constantly, not obsessively, but the way people mention someone who impressed them genuinely and whom they don't encounter enough. Coburn said Bruce described Dean as the only honest man in the room, said it more than once to different people over a period of years. Coburn himself had been struck by Dean's response, had expected Dean to deflect, to make a joke, to deploy the famous Dean Martin charm as a social lubricant. The agreement had surprised him completely. An associate of Steve McQueen's, speaking in the 1990s about McQueen's complicated feelings about Bruce Lee, described McQueen as having been privately embarrassed by the incident at the party. Not by Bruce's challenge specifically, but by his own defensive response to it and by the contrast with Dean's composure. McQueen was not a man who liked being shown up in any context, and the fact that Dean had handled the moment better than he had stayed with him. The associate said McQueen never discussed it directly, but that the party came up occasionally in contexts that made his discomfort with how it had unfolded clear. A close friend of Sharon Tate's, giving an interview in the early 2000s about the social world Sharon had moved through in the early 1970s, mentioned the party in the context of describing Sharon's gift for managing difficult social situations. She said Sharon had described the Bruce Lee outburst as one of the strangest moments she'd witnessed at any gathering she'd hosted. Not because Bruce had said what he said, but because of what Dean had said in response. Sharon had apparently found Dean's agreement both unexpected and somehow correct, had said afterward that Dean had handled it the way it should have been handled and that she wished she'd thought of it. An Elvis Presley biographer who had researched the period extensively wrote in 2015 about Elvis's social world during his Las Vegas years and the Hollywood parties that formed part of his social landscape. He mentioned the Bruce Lee incident as something Elvis had described to his inner circle, had apparently told people that Dean had handled Bruce better than anyone else could have, that the honesty had been unexpected and had worked in a way that defensiveness or humor never would have. Elvis had been in the room, had seen it happen, and had recognized something in Dean's response that he'd spent time thinking about afterward. Nobody who had been there, across all these accounts, had been able to report what Bruce and Dean had actually said to each other during the hour they spent talking. Nobody knew the substance of the conversation. Nobody knew what specific exchange had made Bruce laugh. Nobody knew what had been said that made both men nod in the particular way that people nod when something true has been acknowledged. The story stayed incomplete in that essential way. The outlines clear, the center private. Nobody knew for decades what passed between them. Nobody knew why Bruce Lee, who by all accounts trusted almost nobody in Hollywood, had trusted Dean enough to sit down with him for an hour and talk without the performance that characterized every other conversation in that room. Nobody knew what Dean said that earned that trust or what Bruce said that made Dean lower whatever guard he still maintained. The story existed as an outline with the interior removed, the setting visible, the positions clear, the aftermath documented, the actual content missing. If you were in that room in 1972, if Bruce Lee challenged you in front of Steve McQueen and Elvis Presley and everyone else who was there, if he called you fake in front of Hollywood royalty, if every social instinct you had pointed toward deflection or defense or a well-timed joke to break the tension, what would you do? Could you agree with him? Could you look a man like Bruce Lee in the eyes and say, yes, you're right, I'm exactly what you think I am? Or would the social pressure, the audience, the need to protect the image you'd spent years building, push you toward the easier response? If you want to know what Dean and Bruce talked about for that hour, what made Bruce respect him, what made Dean laugh, what truth passed between them, subscribe. The full conversation is coming. After Bruce sat down next to Dean, after the party resumed its performance around them, the two men talked. Bruce started. "Why did you agree with me?" Dean looked at him. "Because you were right. Everyone in this room knows you're right." Bruce said, "But you're the only one who said it." "Why?" Dean thought about it. "Because I've spent 40 years being honest about the performance," he said. "If I started lying about it now, what would be the point of the last 40 years? Bruce nodded slowly. "You know what you are." "I know what I'm not," Dean said. "That's easier. I'm not a tough guy. Not a fighter. Not the drunk I play on stage. I'm Dino Crossetti who learned to perform Dean Martin. The performance works because I never confuse it with who I am." "Most people here can't tell the difference anymore," Bruce said. "I know. Does that bother you?" Dean sipped his apple juice. "Used to. Now I just accept it. They're doing their job. The job requires the confusion. I just chose not to be confused myself." Bruce looked at the room, at Steve McQueen talking loudly near the bar, at Elvis laughing too hard at someone's joke, at all the performances continuing around them. "I hate it here," Bruce said quietly. "I hate Hollywood. Everyone's fake. Everyone's performing. Nobody's real." "You're real," Dean said. Bruce looked at him sharply. "What? You're real. That's your problem. You came to Hollywood being exactly who you are, and you expected everyone else to be the same. They're not. They can't be. The job won't let them." "You're real too," Bruce said. Dean smiled slightly. "I'm really good at performing." "There's a difference." "No," Bruce insisted. "Just now, when I challenged the room, you didn't perform toughness. You didn't perform offense. You didn't perform anything. You just told the truth. Because the truth was easier than the performance," Dean said. "I'm too tired to pretend tonight." Bruce studied him. "You're always tired, aren't you? Of the performance. Of being Dean Martin instead of whoever you actually are." Dean didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter. "Yeah," he said. "I am. But I chose this. I built Dean Martin deliberately, so I don't get to complain about carrying him around. You can still be tired of it, I can. But I can't stop. Not yet. Maybe not ever." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Bruce asked the question that got to the heart of it. "If you could stop being Dean Martin tomorrow, just be Dino, would you?" Dean thought about it. Really thought about it. "I don't know," he said finally. "I've been Dean Martin longer than I was Dino. I'm not sure Dino exists anymore as anything other than the guy who built Dean Martin." "That's the saddest thing I've ever heard," Bruce said. Dean laughed. A real laugh. "You asked for honesty." "I did. Then there it is. I performed so well for so long that I might have performed myself out of existence." Bruce leaned back. "But you know it, you see it. That's what makes you different from them." He gestured at the room. "They don't even know they're performing anymore. They think the character iced them. You know better." "Knowing better doesn't fix it," Den said. "No, but it keeps you honest. And honest is the only thing that matters." The conversation continued about discipline, about performance, about the difference between martial arts as performance and martial arts as reality, about Den's apple juice, about Bruce's frustration with Hollywood's approach to everything he valued, about honesty as the hardest discipline. By the time the party wound down, Bruce and Dean had been talking for over an hour uninterrupted. In the middle of a party, while Hollywood performed around them, as Bruce stood to leave, he looked at Dean. "You're the only real one here." Dean smiled. "I'm the only honest one. There's a difference." "Shh, not to me," Bruce said. They shook hands. Bruce left. Dan stayed a few more minutes, finished his apple juice, thanked Sharon for hosting, drove home, and never told anyone about the conversation. But Bruce did. To understand what made Dean capable of that honesty in that moment, you have to understand what Bruce Lee's Hollywood frustration actually was. Not just the surface complaint about fight choreography and performed toughness, but the deeper philosophical problem that the party represented for him. Bruce had come to Hollywood with a system, not just a fighting system, a system for living. Jeet Kune Do was at its core, a philosophy of directness, of cutting away everything ornamental and getting to what was actually true, what actually worked, what would actually hold up when reality applied its pressure. He developed it by looking honestly at what traditional martial arts styles actually were versus what they claimed to be, by asking whether the techniques would function in a real confrontation rather than a controlled demonstration, by eliminating the movements that looked impressive but accomplished nothing, by keeping only what survived contact with reality. He applied this same standard to everything, to people, to relationships, to conversations. He had almost no tolerance for performance in social contexts because he experienced performance as a form of dishonesty, and dishonesty was the one quality he found genuinely intolerable. Hollywood, in which dishonesty was not a failure but a professional requirement, was therefore almost unbearable. He'd been in it long enough to understand that he needed it. Needed the platform, the visibility, the reach that Hollywood could provide for the ideas he wanted to communicate. But the cost of that need was proximity to everything he found philosophically offensive. The party was the concentrated version of that, the room full of people doing exactly what he found intolerable. His outburst was not calculated. It was the release of months of accumulated pressure meeting 3 hours of concentrated provocation in a room where, finally, he decided he didn't care about the social consequences of saying what he actually thought. What Bruce Lee found in Dean Martin that night was something he hadn't expected to find in that room or in Hollywood generally. A man who had the same clarity about what he was doing that Bruce had about what he was doing, who had maintained that clarity over 40 years of professional performance, and who could acknowledge it without defense or apology or the particular social embarrassment that honesty about performance produces in people who've lost track of the distinction. Dean had, in a sense, solved the problem that was destroying Bruce's relationship with Hollywood, had found a way to operate within the performance world without being consumed by it, had maintained the line between Dino and Dean so carefully and for so long that the line was still there, intact, visible to anyone who knew to look for it. Bruce could see the line. He was one of the few people in that room who could, and what he saw in Dean was not compromise eruption but a form of integrity that he hadn't anticipated, the integrity of someone who performs consciously and fully while never confusing the performance with the self. The apple juice was the perfect symbol. The glass that looked like whiskey, the performance so complete that nobody questioned it. But Den knowing, always, what was in the glass. In the weeks and months after the party, Bruce told people about the conversation, not as a story he was performing, not as an anecdote he was using to establish something about himself, but in the direct way he told people things he found significant. He said Dean Martin was the only real one in Hollywood, said it to James Coburn, said it to people he trained with, said it to people who asked him about the famous faces he'd encountered in the Hollywood social world. He qualified it when he was being precise, said Dean was the only honest one, which was different from being real, but the difference didn't matter much because honesty was the closest thing to real that Hollywood was capable of producing. Dean, for his part, never told the story, never mentioned the conversation publicly, never used Bruce Lee's name in an interview in a way that acknowledged the evening. This was entirely consistent with how Dean operated. The significant things stayed private. The private things stayed where they belonged. and the performance that was visible to the world remained separate from the reality that wasn't. His reputation in Hollywood shifted subtly after 1972 in ways that nobody could precisely attribute to any single event, but that people who watched carefully could notice. A quality of respect from people who didn't necessarily respect performers. A recognition from people who valued authenticity that Dean possessed something that looked like it, even inside the performance. The party story circulated underground, passed between people who'd been there, whispered at subsequent parties, filed away as one of those Hollywood moments that revealed something true about both the men involved and the world they moved through. The story of Dean Martin and Bruce Lee at that Hollywood Hills party in 1972 is not a story about two famous men having an interesting conversation. It is a story about what honesty actually costs in an environment built entirely on managed appearances, and about what it's worth to the person who practices it. Bruce Lee walked into a room full of performed toughness and named it at social cost because he couldn't not name it. Dean Martin agreed with him at social cost because he'd spent 40 years being honest about exactly what he was, and he wasn't going to stop because the room was full of people who preferred the comfortable lie. Neither of them was performing courage that evening. They were both just being who they were, which, in that particular room on that particular night, was the most courageous thing available. The room full of famous people had backed down from Bruce's challenge not because they were cowards, but because the social machinery they operated within made backing down the rational response. Dean operated outside that machinery, had always operated outside it. The apple juice was the proof, the 30-year performance of the drunk that stayed performance precisely because Dean never let it become something he needed. He didn't need the room's approval. He didn't need Bruce's approval. He just told the truth because the truth was what he had, and it turned out the truth was enough. 1972, a Hollywood party. Bruce Lee challenged everyone, called them fake, called them soft, called them performers pretending to be real. Everyone backed down, made excuses, got defensive. Except Dean Martin. Dean agreed. You're right, fake. The honesty stunned Bruce more than any fight could have. They talked for an hour, while Hollywood performed around them, about truth, about performance, about the cost of never being off. Afterward, Bruce told people Dean Martin is the only real one in Hollywood. Some moments define who you are. Some honesty costs everything but means everything. Dean didn't back down from Bruce Lee by fighting. He didn't back down by being honest. If you want to see more stories about Dean Martin, the moments he chose truth over comfort, the times honesty was his courage, there's an entire playlist waiting. These stories don't stay online forever. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.